We love Zencaster because it allows us to record the audio for our podcast and create the video segments we use for our weekly Sister Scoop episodes. Zencaster has helped us make content capture simple.
It's now super easy to record a podcast with Zencaster. Log in using your browser and start recording a high-quality podcast right away. Record studio quality sound and up to 4K video with your guests, and feel a sense of zen knowing Zencaster's multi-layered backups ensure you always have your recordings in the highest quality, even if the connection is unstable.
If you've thought about podcasting before and realized that you need a lot of different tools and services, those days are over. With Zencaster's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create your podcast in one place and distribute it to Spotify, Apple, and other major destinations.
Just go to zencastr.com/pricing and use our code SistersAssembled, and you'll get 30% off your first month of any Zencaster paid plan. We want you to have the same easy experiences we do for all of our podcasting and content needs. It's time to share your story.
Katie and I are always hungry, and one snack we both love is beef jerky. That's why we're so excited to tell you about one of our favorite jerky brands, Matt Hat Jerky.
Matt Hat's delicious taste makes it a great snack, and the variety of flavors, including original, black truffle, and my personal favorite, roasted garlic, means there's a flavor for everyone. Plus, it's local to the area where we grew up in, which we just love.
Use the link in the show notes below to get some Matt Hat Jerky for yourself, and make sure to use our coupon code SistersAssembled for 10% off. Hello and welcome to Sisters Assembled, your home for all things MCU. And as you know, we have been working diligently through our replay series, and we have finally come to the last property that came out before we started releasing episodes for our show. And if you've been following the release / timeline calendar that we've been following as we've gone through the replay, you know that the next and last property that we have not yet covered is the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which we'll be doing episode by episode starting this week. So without any further ado, I'm going to toss it over to Katie, and she's going to get us started on episode 1.
I would say I've been waiting for this one, but I don't know if I have been, if I'm being honest. I actually think I low-key dread the Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
Interesting. Why?
Well, let me get there. I'm about to explain it.
Well, I am shook by this from you.
Well, I literally was about to go, and you were like, "Tell me why." And I'm like, "Yes, I was actively doing that."
Whatever.
I think obviously it has nothing to do with my love for Sebastian Stan. I love it. I will continue to love it to see him on my screen. I think it's because the Falcon and the Winter Soldier makes me struggle a lot with my relationship with Steve and the Captain America mantle. I also think if we kind of look, and this is maybe a frustrating point of view for some, but if we do look at some of the things that have come out that have included these characters, I mean, we didn't love Sam's first Captain America movie, sadly. We really wanted to. I think we, from a base level, were like, yay, it was an enjoyable superhero movie. From a more fan in-depth look, we were like, ugh, really? That was not great.
Also, not Sam's movie. A Captain America movie about everybody but Captain America.
Yeah, and we'll try our best to kind of avoid some of that, getting into too much of that, because if you really want to listen to our thoughts, go listen to the episode from last summer? No, last February.
February.
Yeah, something like that. And I don't really have any complaints where Bucky went. And that's also not my bias. That truly is I don't really have inherent complaints. I think also, though, a lot of people, and I kind of am aligned with this, feel like we had this show. It showed a lot of bonding. And then we got a Bucky cameo for 5 seconds in, Sam's Captain America movie. And now they're fighting. The girls are fighting. So yeah. I just think kind of knowing where we're at, doing this replay right now is a very weird concept in my mind. And I think the show as a whole stands very well by itself, but I do think, like I said, I think down to the core, I struggle a lot with the whole Captain America mantle, I think, and it starts from this show.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I think from a mantle standpoint, it is interesting, and it really isn't touched on too much yet, in just episode 1, right?
Yeah.
They do talk about, who Steve was, and Captain America isn't it's interesting because in this episode 1, they don't consider it a mantle. Well, at least Sam doesn't consider it a mantle. He's like, Steve is Captain America. He embodies everything that that stands for, all of the goodness of, that is associated with this shield, and that name comes from one man, and that's Steve Rogers. And obviously that's going to morph and evolve throughout the series, but that's like a very rigid point of view that Sam has in this first episode especially, and then obviously the end of the episode, he you can see the gears start to turn a little bit because he realizes not everybody feels the same way. But you're right, and as the series goes, you learn more about the ramifications of Captain America as a mantle and what that means and who was involved and who was affected by that, especially when you start to, Isaiah Bradley, and I know we'll dive much more into kind of that legacy and all those conversations when he gets introduced in the show. But you're right, it is this kind of cognitive dissonance because if you've been listening to our show for any length of time, we love Cap. We are strong Team Cap girlies. We ride or die for our man in red, white, and blue regardless of who holds the mantle. But this show makes that mantle and that legacy much more complicated. And so it creates this dissonance for fans of the character. And I think that's important. I think it creates important conversations, and we are going to try to have them to the best of our ability as the show goes on, and concrete examples open up for us to have those. But you're right, as a whole, it does cause some complications and a little bit of dissonance, especially when you think about where we've been with Captain America up until this point, kind of just stopping at episode 1 and everything that we'd seen up until this point, leaving apart everything that will come after.
Yeah. And I think too, if we kind of rewind our brains back to 2021, when did this come out? Probably like March.
February or March, yeah.
Yeah. So because it was pretty much on the heels of WandaVision. I think if we kind of back that all up and we think back to there, this is the first time we're really seeing, and you kind of said it, there is no mantle yet idea, but
Yeah.
for us, this is the first time we're seeing the mantle be passed down. We've never seen another Captain America, we've never seen another Tony Stark, another Thor, etc. We've only ever seen the OG6 as the OGs, and obviously as time has gone on, we've gotten different variations of kind of mantle passing. I do think, like, obviously right now for Tony, there's kind of a couple that sort of wear it from a leadership perspective. I do think it's Spider-Man, but from that literal suit of armor, it's Ironheart,
Yeah.
so it's there definitely are some that are a little more clear, I think, than others, but this one, like, they come out of the gate swinging with this because they pass this on at the end of Endgame.
Yeah.
This starts at the end of Endgame, and I think it's so interesting to start the show because I have to say, coming right out of the gate, the first episode I was bored.
Really.
Not gonna lie.
I know we felt that way when we first watched it, but I sat there, when I was watching it and thought to myself, I actually am enjoying this more than I did the first time.
Yeah, see, I was bored. I think I fully, like, let me just say, I was eating dinner. So, like, as one does, iPad kid to the greatest, sitting there. I cannot eat by myself half the time in silence. I have to have something on. And I had it on because I, got to multitask and get stuff done. And I was like sitting there and I was like, oh my God, how long is this episode? Like, I truly found myself struggling to get through it. And I do think that's kind of interesting considering we did just do WandaVision. And I think I had such, like, it's almost like those opinions semi switched because I do remember thinking that about the first 2 episodes of WandaVision. But when we rewatched them, I was like, no, I love this. Like, I don't know what I was thinking, ever thinking these are boring. Like, there's so many Easter eggs already in this, like the clues, it's all there, whatever. And then I found myself watching this and I was like, no, I'm bored. And, I think some of it does come down to I didn't realize Sam and Bucky do not interact in the first episode at all.
Yeah, I think that did throw me for a loop. Like, I kept, especially in those later in the episode scenes where Sam is fixing the boat, I was like, so Bucky walks up now, right? Like,
Same,
I was like,
same.
what's going on?
Yeah. No, that's exactly how I was. And I think this all comes from the problem of I actually wouldn't even argue it's Bucky as much as it's Sam. They have never really delved into Sam's character ever.
Yeah.
He's always just been there to help Captain America. And I hate to say it, but that's just the truth. I mean, if we look at everything he's been in, like we know he's a veteran and he used to do all the group sessions and things like that. That's literally how not fully met Steve, but how Steve knew where to find him and things like that. And we get pieces of him. We know he lost his old partner and things of that nature, but we never really get to learn his backstory. And that's okay, I think, for the way he's been used prior as a character. But I do think when we go into this show, they're trying so hard to shove us into understanding Sam as a person and a character that it makes the beginning of the story very, very long.
I can see that perspective. I do think, there are ways to explain who Sam is because I do think that work needs to be done, right? Like
Yeah.
you're setting him up to be the next Captain America, and he, to what you were saying, has just kind of been the sidekick up until this point. And so I think
But
we
then it should have
need.
been only his show and not him and Bucky's. And I hate to say it. I love because guys, catch me next week talk about how much I love episode 2 when those two are on screen together and their dynamic is just amazing and I'm laughing and I love it and everything else. But I do think if you're going to set this is not a new complaint. I know a lot of people who have complained about this since the show's been out. If you were going to set this man up as a character, him and Bucky should not have been equally in that title card.
I think that's fair. I mean, my suggestion would have just been like, instead of doing like a Sam character exposition dump in episode 1, which is essentially what episode 1 is, like
Correct.
they could have integrated that more throughout the series. So it would have felt like maybe some of the action was moved up a little bit, some of the interactions that needed to happen. I'm looking at him and Bucky could have been moved into episode 1 to feel like we're maybe moving the narrative forward instead of just being like, this is who Sam is. We're going to firmly place him. We're going to add the family around him. Like that could have been done, I think, maybe a little bit more throughout the series in different ways. But I do think, to your point, like it's interesting because Sam as Cap has literally never gotten to be on his own. He's never gotten to be like the guy. Even the show that set him up as Captain America, to your point, has Bucky, which Bucky's always been Cap's sidekick. So, like, in some ways that works. But you're right. A lot more work had to be done to set up Sam's character for the heights that he's about to go to. I mean, the man's about to be set up to be Captain America. That is one of the most important mantles in the Avengers the way that we know them in the MCU. So there does need to be a lot of groundwork laid that wasn't done in his previous appearances. So I could see a show that was simply dedicated to the Falcon with less Bucky, but still have him because he, is part of Captain America's story. They do have that connection through Steve. I think they help each other so much, and we'll see that throughout the series grow and evolve. And honestly, like they have so much confidence in each other that it helps them build confidence in themselves. Like Bucky never once doubts that Sam is supposed to be Captain America, and Bucky and Sam never really doubts that Bucky is a good guy and he's changed and he's going to get through all these things, which makes, the current situation that much more heartbreaking between the two of them. So I don't think that Bucky should have been removed completely, but I do think you're right. You could have gone two directions here. It could have been lessen how much time we're spending on Bucky, or work the pacing a little bit differently so that we're learning more about Sam throughout the show than just spending all of episode 1 to do that.
Yeah, I think I prefer option 2 personally because obviously I never want to spend less time on Bucky, but I do think, I struggled a lot and I do think option 2 actually really would have been the answer because I just think there's just so much they tried to shove into the first episode to explain just Sam. And I mean, they had to literally add to me. This is how it felt that they had to add that opening scene of him with the like hijackers or whatever to have an action scene so that people weren't bored. And now, personally, the Falcon's cool. Not really. I like Sam as a character. I love Sam as a character. I'm not out here donning some Falcon memorabilia personally. That's, I'm just not really like, that's my guy. So the action scene's cool, but I'm still also like, I don't need 5 minutes of this.
See, I like his action scenes. I think it's really cool to see him fly, and I honestly think that like in his other appearances you do get some of it, but I don't think you get enough of it because Steve is on the ground. And so like most of his other appearances, who is he to the left of? Steve. And so like at the end of the day, he's either not on the screen because he's flying off screen, or he's grounded with Steve, or we get a few cool shots of him flying. So it was cool, in my opinion, to get to see him like actually kick some booty in the air and like use his skills. I think it also was really cool to see how like he's able to actually work on Red Wing himself and like emphasize how brilliant he is and how he truly understands his own tech and all that stuff, and the way he's creative around like not being able to enter certain country boundaries, and how he like worked through having to kind of ad lib in the air and things like that. I just felt like it was an opportunity for us to kind of see Sam in action without having to cut away to some other character who may just have had higher billing, aka Captain America, because he's the Falcon to the Captain America.
Which is totally fair. I think personally, I just didn't care for it as much. I think the little bit we ever get is enough for me. I'm like, he's flying in the air. Again, I love Sam as a character, but the Falcon as a whole, I do not find him to be the most interesting of the characters that have been introduced. So while he is the Falcon, I think him being kind of the sidekick to Captain America works for me. I think I'm like, okay, cool. I think watching a 5-minute long part of him flying through the air, I was like, I'm bored in an action scene. I am bored during this. So I also do have to say, guys, I'm sure some of it has to come down to I know the show gets better when the two of them are together. So it's like knowing that's coming and then sitting through 45 minutes of them being separated and like us having to catch up on characters. Also, in this sense, I think I struggle doing the replay specifically with these characters because we have relatively recently, I mean, within the year, gotten content from both of them.
Yeah.
So I don't really miss them yet because I don't need to. I just saw them and I just got an update on them and I know what's going on. So I do think going back to WandaVision was one thing. Going back to this show, I'm kind of like, I'm not as excited as I thought I'd be right now.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that because it's like, oh, I'm rewatching this, but at the same time, I know how all of this ends because I literally just saw literally the sequel to this show for
Yeah,
both of them, which happened to be two separate movies that came out this year. Yeah, I mean, I get that. I do though think like there is, I don't know, I found so much value in doing the replays because there's like small stuff that you don't catch, you know?
for sure.
And so, I don't know. I didn't feel that quite. I definitely felt it to some extent, but I didn't feel it quite as much, I think, maybe as you did. But I do want to dive in a little bit more into Sam because, as we've kind of been talking about, you know, he does have kind of the bulk of the character work, I think, being done because we just don't know a lot about who he is besides some of the items that you mentioned at the beginning or earlier in the episode. I think one of the things that this establishes about heroes in general, and kind of like this was a conversation that we were all having at the time as well, is like this weird place that they live in when there is no Avengers team, right? Like he's talking about, oh, I have government contracts, but yet he can't get a loan at the bank, but everybody knows his face. And so it's this weird like dichotomy of like not everybody is, you know, as wealthy as Tony Stark. Some of these folks are just doing this because they feel a calling and because they have the opportunity to help people, yet they're not really being paid for it. And I think that was an interesting conversation. I remember when the show was coming out that everybody was kind of like, wait a minute, that is an odd, like, scenario. And that is a weird thing that, like, how are they doing this? How are they actually out there supporting themselves while also, you know, being the ones who are essentially saving the world?
I think it was also complicated for Sam because he was one of the ones snapped.
Yeah.
And I think in the bank scene specifically, they also kind of bring that up because he's like, you don't have anything for the past 5 years. You have no proof of income. You have nothing. Nothing's there. And so I do think that was kind of something that compounds upon it. It then also made me try and figure out how Bucky was like living because he doesn't own anything at all to his name because he was, you know, kind of not his own property for a long time. So like I think like it makes such an interesting conversation between the two of them because it's like Sam's one end of it where he like was living when I say cushy, I just mean the whole like like Avengers compound kind of like in it and all that kind of thing. Life versus Bucky on the other hand is coming out of like literal torture for 70 years. And it's like,
Well, don't forget though, before Infinity War, Sam was on the run for years too.
Well, that's true. So even longer.
Yeah, so he has literally no trace of him for 5 years, but then in the 2 years previous to that, between Civil War and Infinity War, he was a fugitive. So, I know at that point, like, they mentioned, like, they've all been pardoned and things like that, and, it's very strongly hinted that the Sokovia Accords are no longer in place. That's something that, I think is actually, like, explicitly stated later on, not in this show, but, like, later on in the MCU, we know that they've been repealed, but I believe that's pretty heavily hinted at this point, right? I mean, that was kind of what I got when they talked about Bucky's pardon, for example.
I did not get that at all. And I personally think, had we not already known that the Sokovia Accords were already repealed, I don't think there's any Easter eggs so far in my thought
But do
process.
we know, I guess is the question.
Yeah, they confirm it, I think, in Cat 4 or Thunderbolts. One of them gets it, they do confirm that they took back the Sokovia Accords. I don't remember which one.
It might have been Cat 4 because of the conversation with the president around bringing back the Avengers.
Yeah, I don't remember. But I do think if we didn't have that knowledge, I don't really see there being hints at it in this, just that they were pardoned. And to me, I mean, if I'm looking at it not through the lens of somebody who's seen those movies this year, and somebody who's watching it for the first time, that to me is just the assumption of, well, they helped fight Thanos and like are still heroes, and there's more than, especially for like Bucky and Sam, I feel like there's a lot more to it than just the Accords. So
That's fair. Okay, so maybe I was projecting, but I do think that time on the run definitely also is probably an impact for Sam as well. It's like complicated, his return. Then, of course, he's dusted for 5 years. I think one of the things that I'll be also excited to see, like, as the show continues to move on, that we've already seen touched on very much in episode 1 is the direct ramifications of the snap and the blip. You're talking about Sam not having 5 years of records of his life because he didn't exist for 5 years, but then you're also starting to see things about the flag smashers who are talking about there were no borders, everybody was like working together, it was super cooperative, and they want to return to that way of life, and we're going to have more and more of those conversations as the episode goes on. So I remember thinking that like this show was such a good opportunity to really dive into what those 5 years looked like, and what the blip created in terms of complications when that happened, because WandaVision did it on such a micro scale, right? It was about Wanda and like her personal grief and coming back from that. But then this is talking about it on a much more macro geopolitical scale. So I'll be also really excited to dive back into some of those conversations, because I think it's, knowing that Endgame is coming back into theaters, it's always good to kind of revisit some of these concepts, because especially if we're playing with time and the multiverse, you never know. Maybe we'll end up seeing that time, those 5 years in between at some point, if we're jumping around timelines and things like that.
I think the Flag Smashers, and we didn't get much of them in the first episode, but I think they're a very interesting antagonist. And I do think they got a lot of flack when the show first came out, and a lot of people didn't really like them. But I think the concept behind them is very interesting because, as you kind of laid out, like at a base level, they're just trying to say, like, not inherently that Thanos was right, but the idea of like when there were less people, nobody was hungry, nobody was homeless. Like everybody who was living actually could live within their means, and we had enough for everybody, and people weren't starving and everything else, so people weren't living on food stamps to try and take care of their families and things like that. And so I think on a base level, I think we can all agree and sit there and be like, yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with the idea that everybody should have a house. I don't disagree that everybody should, have a warm place to be, food, things like that. These base level necessities that as humans, I'd like to think we all believe everybody deserves to have. So I think it's hard because as a viewer, this is a type of antagonist, in my opinion, that is very the word sympathetic is not correct, but you can align very clearly with them. However, obviously the concept of how they're trying to go about it is not always gonna be the best. Obviously, we're gonna see that play out more in the next couple episodes, but I do think they have a very clear idea. You see people agree with them. That's why they have that group that's going to sit there and help them, steal the money. That was the concept, right? They literally had people being pretty much decoys for them. And it's very well thought out. And I also have to appreciate that, like, they're using technology of today, because I feel like sometimes when you do look back at some of the other ones, like even some of Iron Man's, obviously they're so smart, some of the villains, that they're using like this intense science, and I'm like, I have to laugh that the Flag Smashers are just like essentially using like secret QR codes. So I'm like, you
Yeah.
know what? You do you. But I do think they get a lot of flack because of the whole super soldier direction that they do go with this. I do almost wonder if there'd be more value in the Flag Smashers if they never went that way. But I think they, and we'll have this debate when we kind of get fully to it, but I obviously think they go this direction because it's a temptation for Sam, and it's a temptation for our brand new Captain America, who gives into it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I definitely agree with kind of your analysis on the Flag Smashers. Like, they were kind of remind me of Killmonger in a way of like, you can't actually, and you don't want to argue against their purpose.
Because they're not inherently wrong.
Right. Like, I agree with Killmonger and his
Yeah.
thoughts. I agree with the Flag Smashers and their thoughts, but I don't necessarily agree with the methodology or the way that they go about it because it ends up hurting people. But, or it could if they weren't stopped. But I do think they are so fascinating from a, a villain standpoint. And I'm excited to kind of watch that trajectory as well. I mean, I think with when it comes to the super soldiers, it's like always going to be one of those things. I think with Captain America, regardless of who holds the mantle, because that was such a big deal for Steve. He was the super soldier and all those things, and that differentiates Sam, right? In terms of how he handles the mantle. And he just wants to be a regular guy who stands up for the right thing, and he doesn't feel the need to have that kind of enhancement. And you're right, it does end up being kind of a temptation for him, but he stands on his principles. And then you have John, who's the exact opposite, and he feels the need to do that because he doesn't feel like he's enough, and he doesn't feel like he's able to, truly embody Captain America without the serum, which then only enhances your true personality, which we then see in the iconic shot that we will absolutely talk about when we get to that episode. But I think that it would have been interesting to kind of see what the perception of the Flag Smashers would have been if they had just maintained, we are just regular humans who want to stand for what we believe in and what we stand for. Their methodologies maybe would have been different. I still think that they were kind of like leaning too far to ever really be like, yeah, I totally agree with the Flag Smashers. And I don't think that they were, the antagonists of the show, because ultimately they, do become pretty violent. But again, the serum enhances kind of your natural tendencies. So if we're looking at, they were getting progressively more violent as the series went on, and then they got the serum, right? Because I don't think they have it. I mean, I know that one guy was enhanced, but not all of them are enhanced, right? They get more serum later.
I can't confirm that right now. I'm not going to lie.
All right. Either way, I think they get more and more violent as the series goes on, and I think it could have been interesting to kind of see if they had just kind of maintained low levels of activity in terms of like how violent they were being and how much they were hurting people, how that could have changed their perception, because I think that there were probably a lot of people who agree with them who were survivors. Obviously, those who were snapped have no frame of reference for what they're trying to say because they weren't around. But for those who were there, maybe there were a lot of people who agree. We see in Hawkeye, which came out in later 2021, the Thanos was right mug. Like, there's a lot of sentiment. That's not what the Flag Smashers are saying, but there's a lot of conflicting sentiment around everything that happened. And I think this show does a really good job of kind of laying out that not everything is so black and white on so many different levels, whether it's talking about the mantle, talking about the Avengers as a whole, talking about everything that happened in Infinity War and Endgame, and the decision to kind of like, let the snap and the blip happen. I don't know that it goes into that level of depth, but it's talking about how regular people were affected and all of those, larger ramifications that not every superhero movie or show goes into. A lot of times it's just, oh, they saved the day and that's great. And then you don't really talk about the people who were on the ground and affected, by those events later on. But I do want to talk about John because we don't get a lot of him
No, we do not.
in this episode.
And it's for the best right now.
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to be quiet when we get to John later in the series because while I don't despise him now, it took a lot for me to get to that place because he's awful in this show.
But honestly, that's what's gonna make this such an interesting rewatch too, after having seen him in the Thunderbolts and no longer like absolutely despising him.
Yeah.
I'm like, is this gonna just re-up my hatred for you? Because
We might have to watch the Thunderbolts again just to be like, I don't hate John Walker.
I know. Or is it gonna completely change my perspective of him going back into this show? I think John is such a complicated character, and we will talk about him a lot more as we go throughout the show. But I do think I want to, because it's not really fair for us to talk about somebody who's never even talked yet in the show. But I do want to talk about the concept of the Flag Smashers seemingly being part of the reason he is the one who kind of comes, or at least there is a new Captain America, if you will.
hmm
And I want to dive into the idea of Sam giving up the mantle to not restore it. That's not really the word. To
Preserve it.
thank you. To preserve the mantle, to, as he even says in a speech, nobody is ever going to be Steve Rogers. Steve Rogers is Captain America. And now I would like to think there was never really a plan to have a new Captain America, just for my own sanity and sake, to think that people aren't that crappy.
Yeah.
I would like to think they genuinely were going to put it in the museum, have it be that its final resting spot, and that's that. But, not but, I should say, going off of that thought, let's pretend that's true. Let's give people the benefit of the doubt that there was never a plan to have a new Captain America. The Flag Smashers are clearly creating enough of a situation that it feels like, and there's a lack of Avengers, so it feels like we have to, as I'm pretty sure the guy even said, like create our own heroes, homegrown heroes, right? From the start. And I think it's so interesting because, and we haven't heard this whole narrative yet, but I know it's coming. How John talks about, I'm decorated. I've done all this stuff. I've earned it. And I think it's Bucky who's like, well, I know it's Bucky who sits there and goes, have you jumped on top of a grenade? So, I think it's such an interesting concept of how one thing leads to the other. And from the jump, though, we also are talking about the dichotomy between John and Sam. The difference between these two men, one who was gifted it on a silver platter and recognized it wasn't his to take, at least from his own perspective. Obviously, I think you said at the top of the episode, I mean, Bucky is like low key one of his biggest cheerleaders. And I actually think, it's starting to come back to me. John being named Captain America is why Bucky goes to Sam and is like, what did you do? Because he's like, he gave you this.
Yeah. There's so much to unpack here. I think it is such a good insight that you pulled out about how Captain America is or the renaming of a new Captain America, we'll say, is a direct response to the Flag Smashers. I want to add one other reason there. If you think about what the Flag Smashers stand for, think about their name, Flag Smashers. They do not want countries. They do
Yeah.
not want, defined borders. And here's America coming out and saying,
Here's Captain
actually,
America.
here's our symbol of America, and he is reborn in John Walker. So it's like this, very visceral, direct response to this, what could potentially be growing sentiment against specified country borders and kind of the old way of living life. And so it's all about like this idea of like rectifying what was before and what was after, and what do we take, from those 5 years, what do we leave in those 5 years. And it's so interesting to watch America kind of push back and say like, no, 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 this is how we're going to do it. And this is John Walker and he's our guy. And to what you were saying about, Bucky and Sam, and how Bucky has such a strong reaction to Sam giving up the shield, that of course leads to that very iconic line, if he was wrong about you, then he was wrong about me. And so like there are so many layers to that conversation as well. And I cannot wait until we get to the therapy scene. I think it's going to be so much fun to talk about. So I'll leave more of that kind of analysis for when we get there. But there are so many dominoes that come from John Walker being named and all of the things that are going to happen here. But I didn't want to like leave this episode without talking about him, because even though he gets like 5 seconds, even just a little smirk on his face, I was like, oh, the visceral rage is back. But you can't not talk about John.
No, you can't, because he does play such a pivotal role in the rest of the series, along with he continues to play a role.
Yeah.
So I do think, you can't leave him out. But I agree. I mean, America's first reaction being like, "No, here's a superhero literally named Captain America. You think we're smashing our flag? He's wearing it." No. Like it literally is like the most American thing. As Americans, I could sit here and say it's the most American thing to do. But I do think it's also so interesting because you kind of talked about, what do we keep? What do we move on from? What do we continue from before, the snap happened? And I think there's so many parts of this. And I do think we start to see more of that maybe a little bit as the series plays out, from a high level of like what the governments are discussing and things of that nature.
Yeah.
But I do think, the world is in such a weird place. And I think this show kind of puts itself at about like maybe 6 months after the blip. So you got to think, like, some people, the world went back to normal for them. Some people, their world completely got flipped back upside down. So I do think it's kind of interesting as they're trying to come out of that, to see from this country level how these big countries like America are like, absolutely not. This is not going to happen. There's never going to be a world without borders. And I do think, again, as an American and who knows our history, this makes sense for us. This is a very like on par take. So I do think like that's kind of interesting. It's just the whole concept behind it is very interesting. I'm so excited to get back like further into it, but it's hard because, like I said, the first episode focuses so heavily on a lot of the exposition of setting up the show, that it makes it kind of hard to actually get into it, because it never actually gets into anything. It just starts setting everything up for episode 2.
Yeah, exactly. Before we dive into Bucky, because he's really the last big character that we haven't yet spoken about, the last thing I just want to say, and you definitely touched on this in your last, comments that you were making, was that one of the things that I love most about the Captain America films, I mean, I'm talking all four, is how politically driven they are. I just think that from a like government like thriller level, they're so interesting, and I think they hold such a special place in the MCU and such an important place in the MCU, because you can get stuck, in Iron Man's having, fighting daddy's villains or whatever, and Thor's fighting his daddy's villains sometimes, and his brother, and like all this different kind of stuff, and you're dealing with kind of smaller scale, and not necessarily smaller scale events, because they can be large scale events, but like they're not necessarily talking about the impact on such a mega scale. And I think what I love about the Captain America movies is like they are showing the impact of the Avengers and those fights that they're having, even individual Avengers, because when they talk about the Sokovia Accords in Civil War, it's been a hot minute, but I'm pretty sure they show footage from like individual Avengers movies as well. So it's not just what they're doing as a team, it's how are the Avengers actually impacting the geopolitical landscape. And I think that being able to take that step back, I mean, even if you think about the fourth Cap movie that we just saw this year, being able to talk about Tiamat and all of the governments fighting for them, and how those things are how the governments are being impacted by things that we saw in the Eternals film, all of that needs to be addressed. And the only real franchise that is doing that consistently is the Captain America films and TV show. And so I really just am so appreciative of that, because as someone who like is super interested in all of that and that kind of aspect of the world, I think that is so fascinating, and I just want to shout out the Captain America franchise for fighting the good fight on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I also think part of why I'm so drawn into it is because there is that kind of level of political storytelling that is within all of Captain America's films and now TV show and things of that nature. I also think, I feel like you kind of said this, but kind of just the concept of, with Thor, I mean, there's a level of just like, okay, he's a god and he's got the 9 realms, and there's just a lot of things happening, and this weird metal man is coming from the sky trying to blow up Thor, and then there's the dark elves trying to open like this cosmic thingy, and like all this stuff that you're kind of like, yeah, as the superhero watcher, you're like, yeah. And I think what makes Cap's films, and we always talk about Cap being a more grounded hero, even in comparison to, as you said, like Iron Man is sitting here like, oh, my dad made you mad or made your dad mad. okay, you want to kill me. Oh, I made you mad on New Year's because I forgot to come say hi to you. Oh, dang it. Like, like it's just these are almost you were kind of saying like on this mega scale. I actually almost find the political aspect meta because it tells a bigger story. And I think this is why some people don't like the Captain America films because sometimes it relates a little too closely to the things we're seeing on our day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
And so I do think it does tell this story of like, hey, I mean, think about, I mean, the best movie to ever exist in the Marvel Cinematic Universe to this day is Captain America the Winter Soldier. And again, no, I'm not saying that because of Bucky. I am saying that because of the entire storyline wrapped around Hydra growing within S.H.I.E.L.D. and the corruption, and how Captain America stands up at one point and says, the correct people can choose to follow me, and those who don't, we know who you are, and standing up to it. I mean, it's just such an interesting concept to be able to see it and unfortunately relate to parts of it as well, but I do think you really can't tell this type of story with almost any other character.
I totally agree. I totally agree. And I'm always interested in whatever political shenanigans are happening in these films. So I love that aspect. And I know we're gonna get so much more of that as this show goes on. So I'm excited to kind of analyze that and have the opportunity to do that as we dive more deeply into those topics. But Bucky, I'm not even gonna start here because this is your guy, so you can take it away here.
The show took too long to get to Bucky, personally.
I knew that was
I
coming.
No, truly I was like, where's my man? Where's my man? I think because the show did decide to tell the story of both of them, even though I do think there's a part of me that believes it maybe would have done better for Sam's character to mainly focus on him. I think Bucky as a character gets a lot out of this show.
I agree.
And I truly think the only reason he gets as far as he does within the Thunderbolts and stuff is because we watch him grow so much. And for the first time, he's a character that makes so much sense to tell a story like this.
Yeah.
And he is so interesting also because he comes from such a strange perspective of the shield. And I mean, it all starts with he's Steve's best friend. And so I think there's a little bit of the mourning of that happening, but there's also just this unsureness about how to move forward as somebody, as I said earlier, who has literally spent more than half of their life being tortured and used as a weapon. And I think like even down to in the therapy session when she's like, you have to do this because you are now a citizen. You are now just your regular, or what's the army term? And I should know this.
Civilian.
Yes, that's going to be bad that I didn't know that. So, but you're a civilian now. And as part of your pardon, you must do this because, everybody's a little worried you're going to go off the wire again. And like, I do think he's just such an interesting character from a mental health perspective, but also from the shield perspective, truly. And just what he sees with the shield, and we'll get a lot more into that as he appears in the next episode, pretty much yelling at Sam because he's like, "Why did you give it up?" But he, you know, I love him and his amends. I do. I think he's so cute making his amends. I think he's so cute on his little date when he's sitting there. How old are you? 106?
Absolutely no lies.
Yeah.
He's just out here telling truth.
Yeah, what did he say about it? He wears gloves because he's cold.
Yeah, he has
Like
poor circulation.
yeah, like I'm like, stop, I love you, and he's like
Okay, there
besties
were
with
some
this.
lies though.
Yeah, yeah, but like, and he's besties with this older man because he's trying to make amends with him for killing his son, and I think it's such a different story when we pan over to Bucky's side of the episode, but I'm so excited to continue to talk about his story because, like I said, I just think from the two perspectives, I think he represents so well. There's so much to say. And I think he's a lot of why we're able to have some of the further conversations we've had in phases 4 through 6, especially about mental health and why the Thunderbolts was such a successful movie in that department.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think this episode especially, you talked about the two faces of Bucky or the two storylines that he can really bring forward through his character growth being of course the shield and those perspectives and then his mental health, but leaving the shield aside because that aspect is going to become more prominent as the episodes go on, and really focusing on the mental health, him doing his amends and going through and trying to, rectify what he did, and he's not really able to run from that, anymore. And he's having these nightmares where he's remembering it and he feels so guilty with, the older man that he's befriended, but he also at this point he's befriended him, so he doesn't want to tell him what he's done, to his son. He feels this immense amount of guilt, and there's just so many emotions wrapped up in that. And then he's also trying to figure out, how do I move forward in this world, right? How do I make amends for what happened in the past, but then also become my own person, to your point, as a civilian? I mean, I think he says to the therapist, like, I was basically at war or in battle for 90 years straight. I don't know how to be a regular person. I don't know how to be, someone who just goes on dates and someone who just lives a life and builds a life for themselves. And so I think it's so interesting, from I guess you would say like PTSD is like the best way to, I mean, I'm sure there's like a million different mental health conversations to have, but I think with him, like PTSD really comes to the forefront of like, how do I work through those elements, aka the amends, but then also how do I give myself permission to actually have a life moving forward? And knowing that he, goes on to be a congressman, goes on to be a new Avenger, it's this really kind of hopeful experience, I think, of seeing how someone can go through something so traumatic and then come out of it at the other side and be really successful and build a found family for himself who's not Steve Rogers, and have those types of things and have a full life despite everything that had happened to him previously.
Yeah, and I honestly am gonna look Marvel dead in the eyes and say, do not kill Bucky Barnes off at this
I know.
point,
I would be
because this poor
devastated.
man has done everything. And I do think Thunderbolts, Taylor said it perfectly. I do think Thunderbolts was that moment of finally being like, he's figuring it out.
Yeah.
He's moving past the trauma that he has, and he's building a life. And you said it, with a found family and things of that nature. And I swear, if you mess this up for us, I'm gonna be so I might leave. I might leave.
I can't let you leave. We're actually going to be able to watch this movie together in the theater, and I can't let you leave.
I can't in good faith. I can't. Because I think you just said it so beautifully, to sit there and say, like, where this man had started. I mean, not even. We've seen his start. We've seen his downfall. And we've seen him have to rebuild it all over again. And I let somebody, you let Steve be happy. Like, can't we, for the love of God, just let Bucky off the hook? Because this show proves, and now Thunderbolts proves, how much work he really puts into himself and the character development that he's given, which is amazing. I mean, he could have kept being the Winter Soldier. In the comics for a while, he does. And that's not to say he continues to be like Hydra's assassin, but he continues to, you know, be that version of him and go be an assassin, do all of that stuff. Like, he didn't, he chose not to. And so I just leave him alone. That's my that is my message to Marvel. Leave my man alone.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not nearly as deep in the Bucky fandom as you are, obviously, but I will say watching his trajectory has been oddly uplifting just because he has gone through so much and come out the other side that, to watch this guy do it for, oh my God, next year will be 15 years of him playing that character, and then to kill him.
Dude, him and Tom Hiddleston are literally the only two who have been in every phase at this point.
I know. I know. Well, Thor, right? Oh no, because he only had the film, I guess.
Yeah, yes. No, I don't know. That I'm not the one who made that statement.
I think it's because Thor was only in like, what was he in, 5, whereas like Bucky, because
Yeah, I don't think he was
and
in 4.
yeah. Anyway, yes, yes. There are some long-standing actors for sure, but those two may have only are the only ones who have been in every phase. But and Loki's another one. Like, okay, I don't like where they took that character, so we can, not include him in this conversation. But I will say, like, I feel like even as someone who's not a Bucky stan, I feel like we as a fandom have invested so much into Bucky, and rightfully so. He's a complicated character who has done the work and all the things you just said. And I will be devastated if something happens to him, because that's just tragic.
Leave my man alone. You can't give Steve that stupid ending and be like, he finally chose himself. Well, let Bucky choose himself and stay home. Let him stay home.
But did Steve get that ending? Because if the rumors about Doomsday are true.
Listen, listen. If they retcon the worst ending they ever gave to a character, I will be ecstatic.
Oh my god, bring like literal like confetti to the theater.
I will.
I would be so happy. That ending is so dumb.
It'll be like a baby gender reveal. I'll have red, white, and blue everywhere because I will never feel more patriotic than in the moment where I'm like, they've undone the worst thing I feel like they've ever done to me. And they've done some crappy things in phases 4 through 6. But that is somehow worse.
Yeah, yeah, that one's rough. All right. Well, I think I've talked about everything that I wanted to say. I'm excited to get to the kind of meat and potatoes of this show. I know we're going to have so much to talk about from a character development level, geopolitical level, from a mantle discussion and legacies. I mean, there are some really important themes that this show touches on, and I'm excited to dive into those much more as they really become much more prevalent as the series goes on. So make sure that you are following us on your podcast platform of choice so that we can, be in your ears as we do bring out these next couple of episodes talking about the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. You can also check out our website and our Buy Me a Coffee link, both of which are in the show notes below.
You guys can give us a follow on all of our socials, which are linked in the show notes below as well. And we will be back next week as we take on the Falcon and the Winter Soldier episode 2, which we are very excited about because it's where things start to pick up. So we are looking forward to that one. And on that note, Marvel just blew your mind. So let's talk about it.